make more videos talking about non-binary experiences specifically. But for now, just know that non-binary people are valid. Yes.
Valid.
They are valid. Hi, I'm Elliot, and I use they, them pronouns.
And I'm Emiel, and I also use they, them pronouns.
Today, we're going to give you a brief introduction on what trans means. So, like, who can identify as trans, some of the different ways that people use the label, and what it means to them.
So, being trans just means that your gender identity doesn't align with the sex that you were assigned at birth.
And can we define those terms for the people watching this who might not be familiar with terms like gender identity and sex assigned at birth?
Sure. So in most cases when you're born, and sometimes even before you're born, a doctor will look at you and decide based on your anatomy whether you're male, female, or intersex. And a lot of times a doctor will think there's only two options, which would be male and female.
And that's sex assigned at birth?
Yes. And so usually that's going to be written down on your birth certificate and other records.
And then gender identity is more about how you feel and the gendered labels that you know best describe you.
And this is the difference between the words sex and gender more generally too. Sex is about anatomy and gender is about how you feel in your mind.
Yeah, and just a reminder, neither sex or gender is binary, but we can talk more about that later. So, if the sex that you were assigned at birth matches up with your gender identity, then you're not transgender, you're cisgender.
Right, and cisgender just means that you're not transgender.
Right. And like you just said, if you're transgender, then the sex you were assigned at birth doesn't align with your gender identity.
So that's the basic definition, and there are different subcategories of trans people, just like there are different categories of cisgender people.
Yeah, so there are trans people who feel comfortable identifying with one of the binary genders, male and female.
So trans men and trans women. So a trans man is someone whose sex assigned at birth was female, but actually their gender is male. You'll see the acronym FTM, female to male, used a lot to describe trans men.
And trans women generally have the reverse experience. Their sex assigned at birth was male, but their gender is actually female. So you'll see the acronym MTF, male to female, used to describe trans women.
So trans women are women and trans men are men.
Yeah, the label trans man and trans woman refer to a person's gender identity, not the sex that they were assigned at birth.
And some trans men prefer to use the acronym MTM, male to male, to emphasize that they've always been men and they were never actually female.
Right, and in the same way, some trans women prefer the acronym FTF, female to female, meaning that they were always women, never actually male.
So in addition to trans men and trans women, we also have a whole incredible category of people who identify as trans non-binary, meaning that they're trans and they don't identify with either of the binary genders, male or female.
Yeah, and there are a ton of different genders that fall under the non-binary umbrella.
Sure, like you have demigender people, agender people, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary people who prefer to use the word non-binary to describe themselves, and a whole other plethora of people under that umbrella.
Yeah, and we'll be making a lot more videos in the future talking about non-binary experiences specifically. For now, just know that non-binary people are valid, and there's a ton of diversity included under the non-binary label.
And some non-binary people identify as trans, while others don't. Also, some non-binary people identify with the acronym MTF or FTM, while others don't.
Right, and that just depends on personal preference, personal experience, and whatever makes each person feel the most comfortable.
Some more acronyms to know are AFAB and AMAB. AFAB stands for assigned female at birth, and that's the same concept we were talking about earlier, that when the doctor pulled you out and took a look at you, said, hey, that's a girl.
Yeah, and AMAB is assigned male at birth.
And a lot of different people use these acronyms. I know a lot of non-binary people use these terms to describe the sex they were assigned at birth.
And a lot of trans people also use terms like transmasculine or transfeminine. You also might hear transmasc and transfemme for short.
Those are more terms that trans non-binary people can use in addition to trans people who don't identify as non-binary. So we have a lot of different terms. Can we talk for a second about where the word transgender comes from?
Yeah. So trans people have always existed. There have always been people that have existed outside of the sex and gender binaries, or who have moved from one side of the spectrum to the other. But the word transgender is fairly recent. One of the first known uses of the word was in 1965 when a man named Dr. John Olivan put the name in his book Sexual Hygiene and Pathology. Another early use was in 1969 when trans activist Virginia Prince began making the term more popular.
And bonus points to anyone watching whose ears perked up at the year 1969, because that's the year of the Stonewall riots.
Yeah, and trans women of color were a crucial part of the Stonewall riots.
So can we talk for a little bit about the use of the trans flag for a second?
Yeah, so the trans flag was designed by Monica Helms in 1999, and it has 3 colors: light blue, light pink, and white. The light blue and light pink represent the traditional colors for boys and girls, and the white represents people who are intersex, transitioning, or have neutral or undefined gender.
And since we're not going too much into trans history today, let's move on to talking about a not so fun term, dysphoria.
The American Psychiatric Association defines gender dysphoria as a psychological distress that results from an incongruence between a person's sex assigned at birth and their gender identity.
Not all trans people experience dysphoria, but a lot of trans people do.
Yeah, and some trans people will start experiencing dysphoria even in childhood.
Other trans people won't start experiencing it until later in life.
Yeah, and some people like me even look back later in life and can identify how gender dysphoria played a role in their lives earlier, even though they didn't realize at the moment that they were experiencing gender dysphoria. Examples of gender dysphoria can include discomfort at the size of your chest or hips. So, like for me, the discomfort that I feel about the way my chest looks is different than the discomfort I might feel about how I have a little bit extra of a belly or something. Like, dysphoria isn't the same thing as thinking like poor about your like weight and body image, and that's something that we might cover in another video if that's something that you guys would want to talk about. But yeah, just for now, know that gender dysphoria is not about like an ideal body image, but it's actually about like this part of my body either doesn't belong here or like doesn't exist and it should.
Other examples of gender dysphoria could be discomfort about your height, your voice, the appearance of your body, even your haircut could cause you gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and then the reverse of gender dysphoria is gender euphoria, which is a happiness or a joy that you can experience when you think about your true gender identity or when something happens that affirms your gender identity. An example of euphoria could be when an AFAB person wears a binder or shaves their face, or when a trans person gets called by the correct set of pronouns by a stranger.
And a lot of trans people experience gender euphoria once they start to transition.
Right, and the word transition is used to describe the process of moving towards the gender identity that you align with.
And transitioning can look totally different for different people.
Yeah, and some people transition more or less than others. We can talk about different ways that people choose to transition, but just know that not all trans people transition in all of the same ways as other trans people.
Also, transitioning can take different amounts of time for different people.
Yeah, so the first type of transition that we'll talk about is a social transition. One thing that might change when someone transitions socially is their name and pronouns, and another thing that might change is the gender roles that someone lives out. A lot of trans people will go through a name change so that people can call them by a name that affirms their gender identity.
And changing your pronouns is a similar idea. A lot of trans people decide to go by a more gender-affirming set of pronouns or by multiple sets of pronouns.
Yeah, like I use they, them pronouns, and also sometimes he, him pronouns. It all just depends on the people I'm around and the situations that I'm in. So people might go by he, him pronouns, she, her pronouns, or neopronouns like z, them, or am.
And it's important to use and respect people's pronouns. Even if a friend changes the pronouns they use while you know them, it's important to show respect and care for your friend by using their correct name and pronouns, even if it feels tricky or uncomfortable at first. I promise you'll adjust and you'll get it easier the more you use their new name and pronouns.
And another thing that's important to note is that if you accidentally misgender someone by using the wrong pronouns or accidentally use their dead name, not to make it about you or draw unnecessary attention to yourself. We know it's hard, and a lot of us have gone through a similar transition, learning to get into the habit of calling ourselves by the correct name and pronouns.
Yeah, if you misgender or dead name someone, the best thing to do is correct yourself to show that you caught your mistake and that you care about them and move on. And you'll get better in time, and we don't want you to beat yourself up over it.
Exactly.
Another thing that might change when someone comes out as trans is their gender expression.
Gender expression is different from gender identity. I've heard some people say that gender identity is how you identify on the inside, while gender expression is the way you present to the world on the outside, like the clothes you wear, the way that you style your hair, the way you talk and behave, and stuff like that.
Though your gender expression can be really whatever makes you feel the most comfortable, because we all know gender is a construct. There are a lot of trans men whose gender expression is kind of feminine, and there are trans women who have a more masculine gender expression, and that doesn't negate their identities.
Yeah, there's no right way or wrong way to be trans. The point of transitioning or changing your gender expression is to make you more comfortable and confident, more like you.
So that means different things for different people. Like, some trans people will want to medically transition, and others won't.
So can we define real quick what it means to medically transition?
Yeah, so for some trans people, they go on HRT, which stands for hormone replacement therapy.
And with HRT, in most cases, trans men or trans masculine people will take testosterone, while trans women or trans feminine people will take estrogen.
Some trans people also take hormone blockers.
Yeah, and these hormones can help people to feel more comfortable in their bodies and to alleviate gender dysphoria. Like, some of the effects on an AFAB person taking testosterone would be their voice deepening, growing facial hair, and having a redistribution of fat to make their body look more masculine.
Some people think of it as a second puberty. Your body goes through a bunch of changes the first time you go through puberty, and then your body goes through a different set of changes when you go through HRT.
But one thing's still the same. Acne!
Yay!
A second way people can medically transition is through surgery.
You might hear the terms top and bottom surgery. Top surgery is about removing or enhancing a person's chest to better match their gender identity, and bottom surgery is about changing a person's external sexual organs. Although, fun fact, with the success of uterus transplants between AFAB people, doctors now think it's possible to transplant a uterus into a trans woman that even would allow her the capability for pregnancy and childbirth.
Yeah, and we hope to talk more in depth about transitioning in a future set of videos about being trans.
So in this video, we've gone through a ton of terms and definitions. So we're going to be making a part 2 of this video to talk more about some common questions people have about trans experiences and about our own personal experiences being trans.
Yeah. And for now, thank you so much, Emiel, for joining us and for sharing some of your own experience.
Oh, no problem.
Thank you also to everyone watching. We'll be doing a series of different trans experiences and issues in the future, so please let us know what you'd like us to talk about more in those videos and in the part 2 of this video.
We'll also be doing a binder giveaway during that future series, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and in the meantime, you can follow us on Instagram at Queer Resources. And if you don't want to miss out on a chance to receive a free binder, you might want to hit subscribe to stay notified and follow us at our Instagram at Queer Resources.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.